Hello, today we're going to talk about the strategy of international business, and we're going to cover a couple of different points. We're going to talk about the concept of strategy. We'll talk about how firms can improve their profit through expanding globally. We're going to look at how pressures on cost reduction, as well as a need for differentiation in different markets, can push multinational enterprises towards one of four generic international strategies. And we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of those different methods. So let's jump right in and talk about what do we mean by strategy. Strategy is actually very simple. It's the actions taken by people in a firm to reach the goals of the firm. And typically you're going to hear strategy couched in terms of improving profitability or profit growth over time. But just remember, it is that simple. It's understanding these different steps that you want to do to reach your goal and then very deliberately taking them to get there. When we talk a little bit about some of the things you want to keep in mind with strategy, it's important to get alignment across the structure of the firm, the processes that are in use at the firm, incentives that motivate people and controls that manage them, as well as the kind of culture you have in the organization. Those four crucial building blocks are things that you really need to have aligned and reinforcing one another to give the people that are in the middle a clear understanding of not just what to do, but how to do it. And again, incredibly important concept for strategy is the idea of being very deliberate and aligning all of these things so that the people that are actually working in the firm have a good understanding of what they need to do to be successful. So let's introduce another concept related to strategy. We talked about some of these building blocks and the definition, and we'll talk a little bit about strategic positioning at this point. And here we go back to the concept of the efficiency frontier. And with the efficiency frontier, you want to make sure that you're picking a point on this efficiency frontier that is balancing cost as well as features on a position in the curve that has sufficient demand to be successful in your operation. Once you've picked this position on the efficient frontier and you understand how you're competing in terms of cost and perceived value through differentiation of your product or service, you have then picked that good position that will let you go back and align those four key building blocks that we had just talked about with regards to your processes, your culture, your incentives and control. So moving along from the efficient frontier concept, once you have these things together, you can improve the profitability of the firm through having the operations that support the firm's strategy, the organization's architecture that matches the firm's operation and strategy. But it's important to remember that the global economy is very dynamic, and it is uncommon for a firm to have success with the same strategy for an extended period of time. Whether changes are coming from endogenous or exogenous sources, one of the keys with strategy is that you have to constantly be revisiting it and tuning it to make sure that you're aiming at the right place on the efficiency frontier and that you have all of these four supporting building blocks aligned and congruent so that your people know what they need to do. Let's keep on the subject of improving profitability and talk about some of the ways that firms improve profitability through international expansion. These range from very simple to quite abstract and complex. So let's start with things that are pretty simple first. Firstly, you can enter into markets where the competition there lacks the core competencies of your firm. This is perhaps the most classic form of international expansion. It's looking at markets that really don't have your product or service, at least not in the way that you deliver it, and that differentiation enables you to get in there and command a good margin. We also introduced this idea of location economies. Companies want to expand internationally to realize benefits from a location economy. So what is a location economy? Simply put, it is a place where a particular activity or skill is really well done. Think Silicon Valley for technology. If you're a design firm, you might think about Scandinavian capitals or Italian capitals. Semiconductors, you're going to be looking at Taipei or Singapore. But the idea that if you go to a location economy, you're going to find more skilled staff and better supporting industries. Some of those factors in Porter's Diamond that can help you be more competitive as a firm overall. Thirdly, we talk about exploiting experience curves benefit. And here, this is where, based on how you choose to enter a market, you might have your production in different places around the world, usually taking advantage of some of these location economy ideas. But again, with the idea that as you put your production or your provision of services more in these different locations, you are learning and you are getting better, and you're able to draw experience effects into your internal processes that will help you achieve a more healthy margin. Last and most abstract is this idea of skills transference. A lot of companies do well from a profitability point of view by going to different markets to learn better about them, and then also to learn things that are valuable about their products or services that can be applied in other markets. So it's a little bit abstract, but it's incredibly important that as the organization grows and spreads, it really needs to be focused on what it's doing with that intellectual capital that it's growing, and that it's making sure the intellectual capital can go to all of the areas of the firm around the world. So those 4 different aspects are ways in which international growth can help drive better profitability for a firm. In terms of choosing your actual strategy, I mentioned earlier we've got 4 generic strategies for international business. And it's very important to think about them in the context of this diagram, where on one end you've got pressures for cost reductions. This is how intense is the competition for your product or service related to the price. Is it become a commodity, perhaps like shoes or basic ingredients like flour, where people are really motivated by getting a low price other than some kind of perceived area of differentiation providing value? That's one of your axes. On the other axis, you got the pressure for local responsiveness. To what extent do people demand that products are a little bit different for them? And here you have a variety of different pressures. If you think about something like the iPhone, for example, this is a standard product all across the world and people want it. There is not pressure for local responsiveness. But if you think about food, tastes really vary according to country and culture, and people want their food products to be very aligned with their tastes. So from those 2 axes of pressure for cost reduction and pressure for local responsiveness, you basically get 4 quadrants that are giving you 4 generic strategies. And I'll talk through them a little bit briefly. First, the international strategy is what's in this bottom left-hand box, where there's little pressure on cost reduction or for local responsiveness. And what you would tend to find, companies that are going to be in the international strategy category, they tend to export from their home market, right? Because they don't see a need to create different products and services for different markets, and they're not so pressured in terms of cost to where transportation really becomes a significant consideration. So this is a perfectly valid strategy, and it's a somewhat immature strategy. A lot of people start here because if you have a factory or a team of people that provide services, it is an easy way to dip your toe in the water by taking this sort of international strategy approach. So I'm going to move up now. And if you have little pressure for local responsiveness, but you do have high pressure for cost reduction, that's going to put you in the upper left quadrant. And we call that the global standardization strategy. Basically, what this means is that the cost pressures are driving you to look to see where you can produce your product or service in a place that's going to be the lowest cost possible. You've seen this with textile manufacturers moving to lower wage countries, all sorts of manufacturing. If you think about the move of television sets from having been made in the West and then to Europe and then to Asia and then to lower cost countries within Asia, this is a really good example of how cost pressures cause people to think about where they're going to do their activities and to base them in areas where they can do them in a very cost-effective manner. So we're going to go now down and to the right where we experience a lot of pressure for local responsiveness. This is where the markets vary across the world and people are demanding that your product or service is tailored to them. And this leads you towards a localization strategy where you're going to have significant presence in these different markets so that your products and services can fundamentally be different. It is an expensive strategy because you're replicating a lot of functions in different places, but that does give you the local knowledge and the agility to be able to respond to those local markets. So up in the top right-hand category, this is perhaps the most aspirational place to be. We call this the transnational strategy. And really what we're describing here is people have got the best of both worlds. They have optimized their production chain to such a point that they're able to get very, very good cost advantages. And at the same time, they do have an ability to pivot and to vary that product or service locally. This is kind of a later phase of evolution for most companies. It would be unusual that somebody is just able to emerge and from day one truly act like a transnational type multinational enterprise, because you usually have to have an awful lot of experience and learning to be able to do those two things really well. So you've got these four different options. Let's go ahead and take transnational off to the side because it's a little bit aspirational of where people would like to get to. But you can see that once you get out of this very basic international strategy, you can make this choice between two very different paths of going to local support through localization. You'll also hear this referred to as a multi-domestic strategy, or a global standardization strategy where you're really focusing everything you can on decreasing unit costs. Something that's important to remember about these generic strategies is these choices are not static. It is very common that you will see multinational enterprises start with one and evolve or pivot to another based on what's going on in the marketplace. As competition increases, international and localization strategies become a little bit less viable, and oftentimes there's perhaps these upper levels of global standardization and transnational, they're seen as being a little more evolved in terms of people requiring more experience and more effort to get there. That's a little bit of an overview of international strategy and how they can be applied at multinational enterprises. Thank you.